Welcome to today's episode of Decisions Now. I'm your host, Erin Pearson, and I'm very excited because today we have Raúl Arredondo joining us. So Raúl has been working in global strategy and as a marketing executive in the battery space for the past decade or so. So Raúl, it's great to have you joining us today. Can you walk us through a few areas that you've worked in the past to just help set a bit of context for people listening in today?
Sure. Thank you, Erin. And thank you for the invitation. So I've been in and around the battery life cycle for some time now. I've worked in the automotive space with automakers, and that was maybe the first exposure to battery and the battery space as basically as someone purchasing batteries. Then I also spent some time at Clarios, who is a very large battery supplier, probably still the largest. And at that point, I became part of the supply base because we help customers with their battery needs. And then more recently now with Rockwell, I was still part of the ecosystem where we're helping battery makers and automakers also, but battery makers produce battery cells and optimize them for automotive usage. I did have also in between there some experience with mining, and that's also a big component of the battery space because obviously there's the key components, lithium, etc. They are products that are or material that are typically mined.
Yeah. Well, I think actually, if I'm not mistaken, there was an article that just came out about one of the biggest areas to potentially mine is in Nevada for some battery materials as well.
Correct. And I spent a lot of time for personal reasons and professional reasons reading about these things. But yes, that was an announcement made a couple of weeks ago where the largest single deposit of lithium might potentially be in the U.S. And if you're not in this space, what it means is that we potentially could go from being completely dependent of China, because China owns most of the deposits of lithium, as well as the refinement of the lithium, to potentially being able to decouple one of the key components of batteries and being able to develop our own ecosystem here in the US. So if it's proven to be correct, the deposits and they're able to extract it, which I think that piece, the technical piece, I think should be pretty straightforward. Yes, we may be looking at becoming independent from China, at least for lithium.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting. That kind of leads me into the next question, is that you've really been on the front line of this industry. So there's been a big evolution of smart manufacturing, and that's changed the growth trajectory of electric vehicles and the battery industry as a whole. So can you talk a little bit about what that evolution has been like?
Sure. So this you have to a little bit exclude Tesla, because Tesla is very unique in everything that they've done. And yes, if you're a billionaire, yes, things are gonna be easier. But for most of the industry, what has happened is that maybe 10 years ago, no one spoke of full electrical vehicles because there were still a lot of gains, a lot of technology innovation, et cetera, going into IC, internal combustion engines. So it was really not in anyone's plan. It was just a thought that some people had, et cetera. And what has happened is that, and maybe Tesla is a factor, but a lot of the governments have essentially mandated no more emissions. And has essentially, the governments have pushed the whole industry into zero emissions. Originally, a lot of people were trying to tackle that through diesel and other things, and the the restrictions got so severe that an electrical vehicle is the only option. So what essentially happened is that you went, and you can take any example, literally any example, any automaker, but you went from I don't need to do any electrical vehicle to I guess I have to do some electrical vehicles. Maybe I'll do some plug-in hybrids, etc. To now I need to do electrical vehicles. And what that has caused is that companies for, I don't want to say hundreds of years, but dozens of years, decades, they've been investing in manufacturing ICE vehicles, which are more complicated, have more parts to producing both ICE and electrical vehicles, which causes a lot of issues, especially in the final assembly, to now starting to pivot to say, well, I'm only going to produce electrical vehicles. And you actually see it with the here in the U.S. with the union. One of the key things for electrical vehicles, it's much simpler vehicles. So you're going from thousands and thousands of parts to maybe up to 2,000 parts, and so the assembly required diminishes, the need for people diminishes, etc. And not only that, but the biggest change that automakers have seen, that they used to produce the heart of the vehicle, if you will, which is the engine. Well, now they have to purchase the battery cells, which is really the heart of an electrical vehicle. And in many vehicles, it's half of the value of the vehicle. So you're basically, it's complete chaos, if you will, and we are going through a transition period. 10 years from now, when someone says automotive, it's going to be implied that it means EV plus battery. But today it's chaotic, and if you're into opportunities, this is the opportunity, because everything is a little bit dynamic, everything is changing. So this is where businesses can really thrive.
Yeah. Well, with that, there's the classic reference that everyone always makes to the original, like, Henry Ford assembly line when making cars and moving from a horse and buggy to a combustion engine. So maybe in 10 to 20 years, that expression is going to change again.
Yes. Yeah. And it's going to be very interesting because history is an amazing teacher. But sometimes we forget our lessons. But for your example of Henry Ford, when Henry Ford started Ford, and different companies back then took a different approach, but Henry Ford decided, as a competitive advantage, they would vertically integrate, and they would basically buy raw steel, make all the panels, weld all the structures, etc. The industry in the last 50 years has moved to the automaker Ford only makes the final assembly of the vehicle. Well, guess what? Now, with the battery cells being such critical component, not only in terms of the value of the vehicle, but just of the performance of the vehicle, what you see out there is all automakers are trying to vertically integrate their battery supply. And what you see is a lot of them investing in the mining, etc., and not necessarily investing in battery cells. And the only reason for that is that battery cell makers, in many cases, are larger than the automakers, but the intent is there. And that's also an amazing thing about this industry, that they spend 50 years refocusing all their energies on final assembly, and now everyone is trying to vertically integrate as much as possible.
Yeah, I mean, that is actually quite interesting. That is it's completely changing how people are approaching it. So one of the things that you've done is you've managed product lines over about $1 billion in the battery space, which naturally requires a lot of nuanced decisions when you are managing a budget of that size. So how do you use market insights that you're collecting across the board to help influence these different decisions?
Sure. So Market intelligence is very important because when when you're developing a strategy, and especially if it's a space where you already know, and I'm using air quotes because especially when you spend so much time in one industry, you may start believing that you know everything because you say, well, I've been in automotive for 20 years. There's nothing under the sky that's going to surprise me. And so, and then obviously you also have the other extreme of people don't know automotive, don't know battery. They just need basic, basic information. But in either case, market research, market insights are very, very, very important because in my case, a lot of times I may have blind spots in my strategy. Why? Because I believe in certain things, I read certain things, so I believe that the best approach, the best way to grow above market is a specific area within battery. It's through market insights that, yes, sometimes you get the confirmation of what your gut was telling you, but sometimes it tells you, you know what? It is this area, but it's not these group of companies that you were thinking about. It's actually these other folks, or it's not this region, right? Because I live in the US and maybe I only see that, oh, it's growing so much here in the US, not realizing that China is going 10 times faster. So market research is very critical in my mind for those blind spots. Because as you get more and more into strategy and you continue this journey in specific industries, you run the risk of saying, well, I already know everything. So whatever I say must be true. And you do need that data. And here's the other thing, even if you do have data from one source, it's always good to get a second source because again, it could be the way the source measures things. It could be the sample size. It could be so many things. So market insights are always a must, in my opinion, to do a successful strategy.
And just for clarity, when you say multiple sources, what type of sources are you using to gather the market insights?
So I'm not obviously going to name names here, but so there are companies out there, for example, that focus on keeping track of production at a vehicle level. Those same companies, or sometimes different companies, they also have forecasts of the usage of specific components. So let's say there's a company out there that says these are how many vehicles are being produced in one assembly line per year, per month, per day, etc. There's other companies that can also provide you a view of how many individual cells do those vehicles consume. There are then companies that say, well, where do those cells come from, or who is producing cells that's selling to this automaker? So there's no, and at least what I found, there's no single company out there that says, I'll give you everything you ever wanted to know from how the cells are being assembled, who's using them, when are they being assembled, who's producing them, when are they producing them. And it's probably because most companies, they they tend to focus on one area of the life cycle of the battery or of the automotive space. But I think it's also that again, going back to the blind spots, if you miss some pieces of this, again, you may end up making a decision that's not optimal.
Yeah. No, I think that's interesting. And I mean, even if you ask the same question to multiple people, or in your example, if you kind of ask the same, here's what we're trying to learn to multiple companies or vendors or even AI these days, you're going to get a different answer each time. So there's multiple ways to interpret it and different parts of the value chain that you can answer all of that. So having that comprehensive view is quite important when you are making these quite large decisions as well. So One of the things that you were just talking about as well is you're gathering insights from different countries. You've gathered them from the U.S. to China to France and Argentina. So, what are some of the nuances that you've learned when collecting or interpreting global insights, as each culture is quite different? So, the insights can mean or be applied in different ways.
Yeah, it's so the I guess the best way to look at this is that the safest way to gather data that cuts across multiple countries is numbers. Numbers. I don't want to say they never lie, but going back to my example, if you have production numbers by country, that is safer than saying than doing estimates on market shares, et cetera, et cetera. But having said that, um, or beyond that, you really do get into you really do need to get into the culture, because there are things at a high level. For example, China, the data that you typically get does come from government sources. So they are going to be optimistic by nature, just because it is. I mean, that's just the way it is. And so that's one layer. But the other layer is also, once you start getting into looking at the data and saying, well, why are these numbers so large, or why is this specific number so large? And that's where you really need the help of someone that can give that context to the data that you're seeing, because in the example of batteries, you may see that China, in terms of units of batteries produced, is very high. But then if you don't realize, or if you don't get the data that the chemistries that they're utilizing, or the way they're setting up the software in the vehicle, makes the life of those individual cells so short, then you don't realize that, well, actually they are producing a lot of individual cells, but they're they're not enough, or yeah, they're not enough to satisfy the demand, because the life is actually very short. Or and again, this is where you need help. Or as a consumer, the Chinese consumer does not has not been educated as well as maybe the European consumer, in terms of the effects of a low state of charge battery, the effects of, it's really hot or it's really cold today, or I have the AC on or I don't have the AC on, etc. So there's there's, I think, a lot of layers, if you will, that you get even in the data that you receive originally. And I think the first step as a strategy person is to, at least at the beginning, at least know there is a difference, and it's not apples to
Mm-hmm.
apples. And then work with a partner, with another company, to say, look, I know I'm receiving data that says Europe and China is exactly the same. I know that's not the case. I know enough that I know that's not the case. I need help to figure out what is the difference, or what is driving the numbers to and totality to be the same, but knowing that it's not the same.
Yeah, so being able to pull all of those together and have that context behind it is quite important. Or, I mean, sometimes it's more important to have that executive summary, that aha moment that's pulled out, instead of having to go through, a 100 some page document that's going to detail all of the pieces as well. Um,
Yeah.
so when you have this type of information on hand, how are you tailoring business strategies to cater to the battery needs within the markets that you are working in?
So the approach that I've typically taken is that I do a lot of work with the regions, or with the business units, because it could just be different products all going into battery, or different regions trying to develop, grow the battery business. But in either case, it's the collaboration, and I'll just give the example of with the regions where you spend enough time with the regions to understand that China, and I'm being fairly accurate when I say this, but where China's demand is being driven by the government through the incentives to both the companies that make the batteries as well as to consumers, versus Europe, where there are incentives, but only for the consumers, not for the companies, with the caveat that the companies can access some funding if they do things in a clean way, in an environmentally friendly way, etc. And so there's a lot of collaboration that happens to build all these different pieces so that, and I would say this is very typical of a global company. So when you put it all together, there is a little bit of a story where you say, look, we need to make sure that we help our customers meet certain requirements that the consumers have, because that is the one constant both in Europe and in China, that there is some sentiment that the consumer has that things need to be green, etc. So let's focus on that. That's going to be, let's say, the core of our strategy, global strategy. But now when we deploy it in China, we also have to take into account the lobbying of the Chinese government. But when we go into Europe, what we need to do is maybe not lobbying the government, but maybe we need to work with the companies to get ESG credits. So it's a little bit of like you go down into the regions, you understand what they're trying to do, you bring it all up, and you say these are the common things. So this is where the investments are going to go into, and then you push it back for the deployment where you say, I've taken care of those core necessities, and then the region, because China is so unique, they need to do something very specific. That's recognized as part of the global strategy, but then the funding, the execution happens locally, so that you're essentially optimizing the things that are common, the investments that are common, but you still, I don't want to say allow, because allow is a bad word, but you still enable the region to do what they must do, that's very unique to their region or to their country.
Yeah. So that's quite interesting how you're pulling all of that together. And when you are pulling these insights, you're trying to send them out to different teams so they're actually used and so people can make key decisions off of them. So how are you disseminating this intelligence on a global scale? And when you are looking at the different regions, how many different people are really interacting with the insights that you're sharing?
Yeah, and I'm gonna argue this is probably the most difficult piece in most organizations, just because it's a lot of times the organizational structure doesn't help because I'm talking about my strategy for batteries, but maybe the regions don't see it by industry, maybe they see it by product line, or who knows. So it's that piece is very complicated, but the way I think is the most efficient is you do have to over communicate. That's number one. But when you communicate, I think the most important thing is you should share, and we do share the raw data, but what's more important that we share, what does that mean strategically? So it's not only, hey, someone discovered a big deposit of lithium in Nevada, but hey, between that and the requirements of the IRA to recycle the batteries in country, and then have the new cells use up to 60% of recycled material, you basically communicate to your European friends, hey, with this deposit plus the IRA, just beware that Europe might have to do a counter proposal for the IRA, and there might be a period where they're going to be starving for raw material because it's all going to start concentrating in the US. Mm-hmm. And so part of the communication is that just giving the what's important strategically, the so what, if you will. The other piece I think is, and it's tied to over communicating, is, well, have you communicated through LinkedIn? Have you communicated through email? Do you have, and I'm saying like all these things is things that we do, monthly meetings where all you're doing in these monthly meetings, you're actually sharing these tidbits of new information. And in those meetings, it's both ways, right? Because you're always only seeing what you see. The other person, your counterpart, your partner in the regions may be seeing it differently because they may be reading the same article, and for them it means a completely different thing, right? Because they're in France and that they know that France is trying to invest all their money in nuclear energy, so they really won't put any money towards battery. Who knows? The point being, part of this communication is having those monthly touch points where you simply share what you believe is affecting your strategy, your current strategy, or future strategy, and then all that is happening on an ongoing basis. And then when you actually start creating the strategy, that's where you get into, okay, so all these discussions, what does that mean? Do we need to change our strategy? What are the risks associated with that? If we believe there's a risk, what could be our contingency? All these exercises help, I think, communicate, because you can hear something, but until you start thinking of, well, how does that affect me, or how can I do a countermeasure, etc., that's only when you go from I hear what you're saying to I understand what you're saying.
Well, I think at the end of the day, it really boils down to you make it easy for them, not only to in the format that they're receiving it. Some people, as you mentioned, they might prefer it over like LinkedIn versus email versus in these calls that you're regularly doing. And then also just giving them the why does it matter? So you're piecing all of the threads together for them. And so you're connecting those insights and you're tying them to say, this is what's happening in the market. This is how it impacts our business and some of the key decisions that we're already looking at. So you really need to be quite involved in the overall strategy of the company and being able to put all of those aha moments on top of it.
Yes, yes, that's a very good way of summarizing, yes, because I think it's like in anything that we do, we always need to speak in a way that resonates with your audience. And yes, especially when you're dealing with cultures, that obviously we're doing business in English. I mean, that's just the reality of the world that we live in. Yeah, you have to be aware of the culture of their level of understanding of English. There's a lot of things, but yes, you ultimately have to communicate in a way that resonates to them versus whatever it is that you prefer.
Yeah, no, I think that's actually a really good point also, is just because English is the language of business, it doesn't mean that everyone uses it or speaks about it in the same way. I mean, you have different cultures that use different terminology and they end up meaning different things, or different teams within a company that they can use a word such as a campaign and they can mean very different things when they say that. So making sure that you are speaking the same language, or the language and how it relates and is understandable to your audience, is really key to good communication. So within that,
Yes.
can you talk a little bit about how your teams that you've worked with are structured, and like the type of vendors that you're working with to enable this level of insights in terms of both collection and distribution?
Sure. So and I think this goes into a few of the last experiences that I've had, but there has been a global team where it's basically the center of gravity, if you will, for strategy, because for companies that are global companies, that's how you make sure that things don't go off the rails, but also that's how you assure that you maximize the investments, because there's never enough money or resources, so you always have to make sure that you're using resources and investments in the best way possible. So having a global structure is always core of that. And beyond that, I think it has varied a lot. I can speak about Rockwell. and how we do things. But with Rockwell, again, it's a centralized organization, and then I have help of people that are SMEs in EV and tire, battery, and I also have e-commerce and warehousing. So I have the SMEs because although I've spent a lot of time in automotive and battery, it's very difficult to be deep in every single industry all the time. So you need help, and then each region then also has a kind of like my equivalent, in that there are people that are specifically focused on what should be the strategy for automotive and battery. Now, the caveat there, and this happens in all companies, is that it's never your job never is exactly the same as theirs. So it might be as simple as I don't take into account rail or marine when I do my strategy, and then they do. It could be as simple as that. And sometimes it's completely disconnected. Sometimes it's someone that part-time does something for battery. So, which is okay, but typically you have someone in the region doing that. And then you do have also corporate strategy, and it's important to mention them because ultimately, whatever we do at the industry level, or if you're dealing with products, it has to be aligned with the bigger strategy, right? You can't simply say, I'm going to create this industry strategy in isolation of the corporate strategy. So they're a big component, but they are typically centralized. So then in terms of the partners, it is important that the partners, I think, understand that kind of structure where they do understand that in most cases, the final decision will be done by the global team, but you clearly need buy-in from the regions, right? So a lot of partners, they have to have the ability to obviously work with whoever is in the global team, but at the same time, be able to interact, be able to deliver value to people that are in the region, right? Because here's the thing, especially when you're talking about providers of data and insights, if you don't believe in what you're reading, you're not going to do anything with the data, and that is the worst thing you can do. Spend the time and the effort and the money working with a partner to generate some insights, some data, and then at the end, if someone literally doesn't believe that that's true, you wasted everyone's time. So again, it's important that the partner can work with the regions, can align with the regions. So when the final product comes out, it is something that's accepted. Now, it doesn't mean that, oh, I'm going to read this and I'm going to agree with everything or I'm going to take action on everything, but at least that there's this sense of ownership with that data, with the insights, whatever came out of that.
No, I love that. Having the sense of ownership, I think, also makes the insights that somebody is sharing a lot stronger. And then if they have the ability to build rapport with the team that they're working with, it's going to be just much stronger. You're going to build a better relationship over time. So as we kind of start wrapping up here, I had two final questions for you. But the first is, can you highlight a few key challenges that you see insights professionals needing to prepare for in the upcoming years?
So specifically for people that are working on insights like market research, et cetera. I think the challenge that I see even today, but I think it's going to get worse, is connecting things for the customer. And what it means is that, to me, what it means is that maybe 10 years ago, it was fine to say, okay, this is what's happening with the automaker. Okay, done. I get it. I can take action, etc. But we're living a period where, well, this is what's happened with the automaker, but this is what the battery cell maker is doing. And it's important that it's recognized that one is going to affect the other one, and obviously, or the government taking action, or the government taking action here in the U.S. and that's going to have a consequence in Europe. So yeah, a lot of people talk about how interconnected we are, and we're already somewhat there. But I think that's only going to get worse or better. I mean, because again, it's an opportunity. So I think for someone in working in this industry, I think what's going to happen is that you may find yourself in working on a project where it's automotive, but to do that right, you probably have to pull in something around green energy, probably something around mining, etc., and create this more complete answer, because that's how the world is starting to run. I think there's that, and I think the other piece is, and this is not tied to AI or anything, but I believe we are at the point where raw data is not the issue. You can probably find the raw data anywhere for whatever. I think the next thing is going to be, what is the right data for you to make a decision. And I think sometimes, and it depends, but I think sometimes people that are doing strategy or marketing or whatever it is, sometimes we feel like, well, historically we looked at production numbers, so let's look at production numbers. And sometimes I think we need our partners that are working in market research, that are professional in that, to say, look, you're better off looking at the data at the component level, or you're better off not looking at production but sales because of whatever. So it's I think that's the other thing, that it's no longer the question of can I find the data, it's getting advice of what is the right data to look at.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. I think there also has to be a moment where everyone also realizes they need to have the context to what is the data source that they are basing all of this off of. So there has to be a lot more clarity in terms of where is this data from, whereas today people just are presented numbers and they just take it as if it's going to answer their question. And to an extent, it likely does, but it might not be asking or representing the data in the format of the question that they're truly trying to answer. So I think people are going to get smarter about how they're interpreting the data as well. But my last question for you is, what are your predictions on where the battery industry is headed?
So my prediction, and is that automakers, and I kind of said this before, so I'm going to repeat myself, but automakers and battery cell makers are going to become the same company. However, because currently the major battery cell makers are in most cases larger than their customers, their automaker customers, I think what eventually will happen is that automakers are going to start investing in disruptive battery technology. Think about startups that are using a different chemistry or different manufacturing, and they're going to build those startups, those disruptors into their ecosystem. So, and I'm not making it up entirely because there's many examples, but Stellantis is going to invest in someone that makes silicon-based anodes. And why? Because no one else, the big, large battery cell makers use the normal, I think it's graphene anode. So they're going to buy this, right? They're going to invest, and eventually they're going to integrate it. And then they're going to look at someone that does cathodes, but that they use, I don't know, sulfur instead of lithium, because everyone uses lithium today. And then they're going to invest in that. And before you know it, automakers are essentially going to pay for all these newcomers to displace the incumbents, and I think that's going to be the future. And with the demand being so high, I think there's space for both of them. But I think it's really going to be the automakers that have the financial means. They will have a vertical integrated battery cell supply, which, by the way, includes the recycling. Because if you're investing in someone that makes the cells, the same people could also recycle for you. And if you are able to recycle and buy the material that way, then you're already in compliance with a lot of regulations, etc. So yeah, that's my predictions. Automakers with the financial means will become automakers plus battery cell makers. And then the rest, there's going to be a lot of people that are going to leave the space because of that.
Yeah. Well, we'll see what happens. I think it's a great prediction. And Raúl, I think the conversation today was a lot of fun. I learned a lot, and thank you for joining us. Thanks for listening to this episode of Decisions Now. Check out all episodes at evalueserve.com/podcast, and don't forget to subscribe for future episodes.